would like to welcome Mr. J.T. Turner in Robert Frost, Light and Dark.
I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and wait and watch while the water clears I make. Shan't be gone long. You come too. Going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. Shan't be gone long. You come too. It's one of the very first poems I ever had published. Like most of my poems, I suppose it's about a few different things. Going out to clean the pasture spring, well, that's me, the poet. Sitting down, cleaning my thoughts, my heart, my soul, getting ready to create something for you. And the little calf, well, that's the poem itself. And like a good mother, I go out and burnish it up, get it all ready for you. It's also, I suppose, a bit of an invitation, isn't it? You come read my poetry. Let me share my thoughts with you. It's another poem I wrote once. It also is a bit of an invitation. This is called Come In. As I came to the edge of the woods, thrush music. Now, if it was dusk outside, inside it was dark. Too dark in the woods for a bird by sleight of wing to better its perch for the night, though it could still sing. Last light of the sun that had died in the west still lived for one more song. Far in the pillared dark, thrush music went almost like a call to come into the dark and lament. But no, I was out for stars. I would not come in, and not even if asked, and I hadn't been. Oh, but that's a different sort of an invitation, isn't it? Those are the dark woods. No, that's death. You and I aren't interested in that tonight. No, we're interested in stars, those thousands of points of light that seem to guide us on our way in the darkness. Sorry to be running a little late. I was out for a walk, and I lost track of time. I appreciate you coming here to the cabin so much. I usually hold court at the bread loaf school, which, he said modestly, I helped to found. But some of you know my wife, Eleanor, died a couple of years ago, and not too long ago I had another loss. So I thought you might come here to the cabin. I'm going to buy a place in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I'll still keep the cabin here in Vermont, and I'm just puttering around with it. Anyway, Kay, my secretary, said you wouldn't mind coming here, and Kay is always right. She is not just my secretary, with my Eleanor gone, she is my muse as well. Kay asked me what we should call our little gathering today, and that was a really tough question, because all of the really good titles about me have already been taken, usually by magazine writers. Frost in the morning. Frost in the afternoon. Early frost. Late frost. Frost heaves. Finally I said, why don't we call it Robert Frost, Light and Dark? Oh, Kay said, what a wonderful title. I said, isn't it? I like it too. Mostly I like it because I can pretty much talk about anything I want. It won't make no difference to anybody anyway. You'll have to excuse me now if I seem to brag a bit about my career as a poet. I have achieved a level of success which is referred to as of esteem. As in, Mr. Frost is a poet of esteem. Suppose that means that to a few critical types, people that are really supposed to know about this sort of thing, that my work is worthy. But we like to say in New England, all that don't butter, no parsnips. I was never interested in being a select poet for a select few. No, I wanted to be a poet for every man and woman. I knew that to be a success as a poet, I had to get my books out there into the hands of people that read books, that buy books by the hundreds. And so I dedicated myself to that. But when I write poetry, I like structure. Structure is what I'm all about. The predominant, most of my poems, I suppose, start with a certain structure. I always say that a poem should begin in delight and end in wisdom. Begins in delight, ends in wisdom. Should be about something that had a sort of universal appeal, but then it should give you some kind of a truth. Not a big truth, like cults and sects are founded on, just a simple little bit of truth, a little stay, as I like to say, against the chaos of the world. I think you'll find most of my poems follow that particular structure. This is called After Apple Picking. My long two-pointed ladders sticking through a tree toward heaven's stick. And there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it, and there may be 2 or 3 apples that I didn't pick upon some bough, but I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night, the scent of apples. I am drowsing off. Cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from a drinking drop and held against the world of hoary glass. It melted, and I let it fall and break, but I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. Magnified apples appear and disappear, stem end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. My instep arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of the ladder round. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load unload of apples coming in. For I have had too much of apple picking. I am overtired of the great harvest I myself desire. There were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, lift down and not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the apple cider heaps of no worth. One can see what will trouble this sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. Were he not gone, woodchuck could say, well, that it's like his long sleep as I describe its coming on, or just some human sleep. Begins in delight, ends in wisdom. You're tired. You had a long day. That sweet soreness you sometimes get from doing hard work. You're picking apples all day long. And you got that trouble of going to sleep. Ends in wisdom. Don't we all have trouble going to sleep sometimes? The little sleep, the big sleep. When we know there are things that we want to do left. 1 or 2 barrels that we haven't filled with apples. 1 or 2 pieces of fruit hanging there that you that you haven't plucked yet. Or it could be, and I don't believe I've ever said this in public before, a poem about apples. It's not impossible. A poem can be whatever you think it is. Begins in light, ends in wisdom. I like structure in my poetry. I write sonnets. I write couplets. I write something called blank verse, which is structure without a rhyme scheme to it. I love every form except perhaps free verse. I don't like free verse. To me, that's not poetry at all. I remember once I was invited to a party where Carl Sandburg was being given an award. Of course, Carl Sandburg mostly writes in free verse, and I was very famously quoted as saying, "I would sooner play tennis without a net than write free verse." Oh, Sandburg loved that. I don't think he's had me back since. You mustn't misunderstand me. I hold it a person's unalienable right to go to hell in any way that's needed. I just never want you to go there writing free verse. I like structure to my poetry, and I especially try to combine language, the sound of language, its imperfection, with its halts, its stammers, its stutters, its structure. I try to make conversation into the form of poetry. One of the first poems I ever wrote, my teacher said to me, "Rob, this sounds like you're just talking to someone." I said, "Good, that's what I want." He said, no, that's not poetry, but I believe in not being bullied, and if you believe in something firmly enough, then you follow through with it. And I believe that I have done that. So I try to marry the idea of conversation with that idea of poetic structure that I love. In a disused graveyard, the living come with grassy tread to read the gravestones on the hill. The graveyard draws the living still, but never any more the dead. The verses in it say and say, the ones who live come today to read the stones and go away. Tomorrow, dead will come to stay. So sure of death the marbles rhyme, yet can't help marking all the time how no one dead will seem to come. What is it? Men are shrinking forever. It would be easy to be clever and tell the stones, men hate to die and have stopped dying now forever. I think they would believe the lie. Sounds like a conversation, doesn't it? But there's a rhyme scheme here. Tread, hill, still, dead, say today, away, stay. A tight rhyme scheme that I make it sound like you and I are just having a normal conversation. So I try to marry language, spoken word, with the structure of poetry. I especially love the sounds, the cadences, the structure of language in New England. I love that. You can get away with a lot of mistakes if you come from certain parts of the country, can't you? Grammatically, anyway. This is called Old Man's Winter Night. All out of doors looked darkly in at him, through the thin frost, almost in separate stars that gather on the pane in empty rooms. What kept his eyes from giving back the gaze was the lamp tilted near them in his hand. What kept him from remembering what it was that brought him to that creaking room was age. He stood with the barrels round him at a loss, and having scared the cellar under him, clomping there, he scared it once again, clomping off, and scared the outer night, which has its sounds familiar, like the roar of trees, crack of branches, common things, but nothing so much as beating on a box. A light he was to no one, but himself, where now he sat, concerned with he knew what. A quiet light, and then not even that. He consigned to the moon, such as she was, so late arising, to the broken moon, as being better than the sun in any case for such a charge, his snow on the roof, his icicles along the wall to keep him slept, the log that shifted with a jolt once in the stove disturbed him, and he shifted and eased his heavy breathing, but still slept. One aged man, one man can't keep a house, a farm, a countryside, or if he can, it's thus he does it of a winter night. I never say it's New England, but you know it's New England, don't you? It just feels like it's New England. I am known as a New England poet. I'm very proud and honored to be called a New England poet. I am from California. My mother and father were both teachers. They married, moved out to San Francisco, had myself, my sister Jeannie. We lived in San Francisco for a long time. I know San Francisco like I know my own face. You always know the place you come from, don't you? Dust blowing in from out of town, except where the sea mist laid it down. And I was one of the children told some of that dust was made of gold. My father was a newspaper man and a bit of a politician. Dressed me in a suit, dragged me around to all these political parades and conventions. He was also a bit of a drinker, a gambler. He died when I was 11, didn't leave us with much of anything, so my mother packed Jeannie and I up and brought us back east to be with my father's folks. So I found myself at the age of 11, dropped into the area north of Boston, like an alien dropped out of clear blue sky. I was absolutely mesmerized. I think if you come from a place, you sometimes take it for granted. But if you have to earn your membership, now, that gives you a special focus, I suppose. I've always been fascinated with New England, north of Boston, my entire life. I went to Lawrence High School, a bit of a loner growing up, but I eventually started to play baseball. Oh, loved to play baseball. Still play baseball. It's my favorite thing. My family became deeply concerned that I would grow up and waste my life as a baseball pitcher. Then I started writing poetry. Baseball looked mighty good to the family all of a sudden. Baseball pitchers and poets, they have their moments. It's the intervals in between that are really tough. I graduated valedictorian, co-valedictorian, along with a young woman named Eleanor White. Oh, I was in love with her. We were sweethearts. The minute I was done graduating from high school, I proposed marriage to her. Eleanor was always the more practical one, and Eleanor said, no, we should wait until we were done with college. So I went to Dartmouth for 6 months, and I was done with college. I came back home and I worked all sorts of jobs. I worked in factories, I helped my mother teach in schools, and all the while I just kept on proposing to Eleanor. Finally, she said yes. You know what I think we find really attractive in a person? When that person finds us attractive. So Eleanor gave in and we got married. There's a poem I wrote, it's called Telephone. And I think it speaks a little bit about our relationship. Eleanor's always the practical one, and I was always a bit of a dreamer. And in this poem, it's about a fella You decide what you want with it, of course, but to me, it always struck me that this is a fella who's coming home a little late. And he perhaps has stopped off for a touch of libation. And he is in trouble, if you know what I mean. Oh, you know what I mean. And so he tries to get by with charm. That was me. When I was just as far as I could walk from here today, there was an hour, all still, when, leaning my head against a flower, I heard you talk. Don't say I didn't, but I heard you say, you spoke from that flower on the windowsill. Do you remember what it was you said? First, tell me what it was you thought you heard. Having found the flower and driven a bee away, I leaned my head, and holding by the stalk, I listened, and thought I caught the word. What was it? Did you call me by my name? Or did you say, someone said, come? I heard it as I bowed. I may have thought as much, but not aloud. Well, so I came. Oh yes, I was always the charmer, and Eleanor, she was the practical one. I held some odd jobs. Occasionally I would have a piece of poetry published. My first piece of poetry I had published was called The Butterfly. Paid me $15. It's a terrible poem, don't read it. I went to Harvard University for a little while, but that didn't take either. Finally, my grandfather took pity upon us and bought us a farm in Derry, New Hampshire. And he said if I would stay on that farm, work that farm for 10 years straight, that the farm would be deeded over to Eleanor and myself. I was in heaven. I thought, farmer? Think of all the time I'll have to write poetry. I love the idea, a farmer and a poet just like Virgil. I was a terrible farmer. I would milk the cow at midnight because I was up reading Shakespeare all night long. I would sleep late in the morning. We tried to raise chickens to sell the egg. That didn't work terribly well. Eleanor and I raised our family there. We homeschooled them all. Eleanor and I both did. And we would wake the children in the middle of the night and drag them upstairs to the second floor. We had a telescope set up, and each of the children had their own star. They had to find their star in the middle of the night. And Sundays we would go out for these picnics over to Highland Brook. Something about that farm. Something about those 10 years where it was just me and the family and nature made me a poet. My first 2, 3 books of poetry, all those poems were either written while I was on the farm in Derry or inspired by that time. It changed my life. Those years, which people that know about these things call my Derry years, not my derriere, my Derry years were some of the best. Everything around me inspired me, all of nature. This is called For Once, Then Something. I had this habit. You walk up to a well, you find a well, you do what everyone does, right? You look over the edge into the well, see how much water is in it, how deep it is. I never did that. I used to like to creep sideways up to the well and catch my own reflection in the bottom of it. My neighbors thought that was the most hysterical thing ever, so naturally I wrote a poem about it. For once, then, something. Others taunt me with having knelt at well curbs, always wrong to the light, so never seen deeper down in the well than where the water gives me back in shining surface picture me, myself, godlike, looking out of a wreath of ferns and cloud puffs. Once, when trying to chin against a well curb, I discerned, as I thought, beyond the picture. Through the picture something white, uncertain, something more of the depths. And then I lost it. Water came to rebuke the two. Clear water, one drop fell from a fern and lo, a ripple shook whatever it was lay there at the bottom, blurred it, blotted it out. What was that whiteness? True? Pebble of quartz? For once, then, something. So everything that surrounded me, all the simple things that my neighbors often took for granted, became for me inspiration. This is called birches. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boys been swinging them, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. Often, you must have seen them, loaded with ice, sunny winter morning after a rain. They click upon themselves as the breeze arises, and turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon, the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust. Such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They're dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break, though once they are bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may have seen their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground, like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all the matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out and in to fetch the cat. Some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself, summer or winter, and could play alone. One by one, he subdued his father's trees by riding them down over and over again till he took the stiffness out of them, and not one but hung limp, not one was left for him to conquer. He learned all there was to learn about not launching out too soon, and so not carrying the tree away clear to the ground. He always kept his poise to the top branches, climbing carefully with the same pains you use to fill a cup up to the brim and even above the brim. Then he flung himself outward, feet first with a swish, kicking his way down through the air to the ground. So was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations. Life is too much like a pathless wood, where your face burns and tickles, with the cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping from the twigs having lashed across it open. I'd like to get away from earth a while, and then come back to it and begin over. May no fate willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish, and snatch me away, not to return. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree, and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven, till the tree could bear no more, and dipped its top and set me down again. That would be good, both the going and the coming back. One could do worse than thee, a swinger of birches. Suppose it's a poem about imagination, isn't it? How we struggle and struggle and struggle to get as close to heaven as we can, all the while not wanting to leave the earth. And a neighbor, his name was Napoleon. Napoleon and I would meet once a year at a common wall that he and I shared. And it was our duty every year to walk along this wall and see what stones had fallen, pick the stones up, put them back in place, make sure that this wall was once more repaired between our property. So I wrote this poem. It's called Mending Wall. To read it to you. There's a couple funny things about it I'd like to point out to you. Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on the day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go to each the boulders that have fallen to each. Some are loaves and some so nearly bowls that we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. Oh, it's just another outdoor game, one on the side comes to live more. There where it is, we do not need a wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall and wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it isn't elves exactly, and I'd rather he thought of it for himself. I see him there, bringing stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, it seems to me, not only of woods and the shade of trees, but he will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says it again. Good fences make good neighbors. As my neighbor, Napoleon, I don't give him one single bit of royalty for that, by the way. So I said there's a couple of funny things in this poem that I'd like to share it with you. So right here at the top, something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. What could that be? That's right, it's frost. It's frost. I spent the rest of the poem telling you I don't like walls. I don't like them at all. People think that the theme of this poem is good fences make good neighbors. It's not what I say. The poem is whatever you think it is. But there's another little joke in here, but you only understand it if you read the poem aloud. I always write my poetry to be read aloud, not just to be read silently to yourself. So there's a line in here, before I built a wall, I asked to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense, to be offensive. But if you speak it, it is, and to whom I was like to give offense. I said it was a little joke. I didn't say it was a big fancy. It was a little tiny joke that well, we stayed on the farm in Derry, New Hampshire for 10 years. I kept on sending off poems, and they kept on sending them back to me or sending me rejection letters. Once in a while I would get one published, but I was successful neither at that point as a poet nor as a farmer. I remember I had 3 poems. I sent them off to the Atlantic Monthly, the magazine, and Ellie Sedgwick, the editor of that magazine, wrote back to me and he said, "Dear Mr. Frost, we have no room in our magazine for your vigorous verse." My. I don't know if you read the Atlantic Monthly. I love the Atlantic Monthly. It's a fine magazine. It's a wonderful magazine. I get it all the time. Don't know if you happen to see this particular edition of the Atlantic with my picture on the front that says Robert Frost's America. You may wonder how I go from being rejected by that magazine to being plastered on their front cover. I'll tell you. Eleanor and I decided we'd give up the farm and to change things. So we gathered the children, stood in our kitchen, true story, flipped a coin. Heads, we go to Canada. Tails, we go to England. It was tails. Packed up the family, we went to England. Had some friends there, they made some introductions. Sure enough, a publisher was willing to publish my book of poetry. I was so excited. My friends suggested that if I could get a good review of the magazine, it would help with the sales. So there was an American poet named Ezra Pound who lived not too far from where we were. So I wrote to him and asked him if he would consider reading my book of poetry and do a review of it. And he sent me back a postcard. It was not exactly encouraging. All it said was, "At home, sometime." I'm standing there reading this postcard, and Eleanor looks over at me and she says, "Well, Rob, what does he say?" And I say, "Oh, he wants me to come right over." So I go over, and I introduced myself, and he was as pleasant as you can imagine, invited me, and we talked about mutual friends and poetry and what we liked, and we hit it off rather nicely. And finally he said, "Well, can you give me a copy of your book of poetry?" Do you know, I didn't have one. It was so new, I hadn't even gotten my own copy yet. So the two of us walked down the street to the publishers, and we got a copy of my book of poetry, went back to his apartment, and I sat there watching him read my book of poetry. He laughed exactly once. I knew exactly where he was in the book. Finally, he closed the book and he said, "You don't mind if we like this, do you?" I said, "No, you go ahead and like it all you want." He said, "You had better run along. We are going to review it." Still don't know who we was. There were just the two of us. And it was a wonderful review, and it helped sales. It helped sales so much that a second book of my poems was published in England. He liked my use of setting. This is called Storm Fear. To me, this is a poem. If you're New Englander, you'll appreciate it. I always think it's a young couple, man and his wife, and there's a baby, small child, and there's a terrible storm, terrible New England storm outside, and he's worried. When the wind works against us in the dark and pelts with snow the lowest chamber on the east, and whispers with a sort of stifled bark the beast, "Come out, come out." It costs no inward struggle now to go, oh no. I count our strength, two and a child, those of us not asleep, subdued to mark how the cold creeps as the fire dies at length, how drifts of pile, dooryard and road ungraded, till even the
comforting balm grows far away, and my heart owns a doubt whether 'tis in us to arise with day and save ourselves unaided. Well, it was about that time that the war broke out. Eleanor and I decided that we would pack up the children, come back to America. We were in Grand Central Station, and Eleanor's over at the magazine rack, and she says, "Well, come here." I walk over. She's pointing to a magazine. She says, "Do you know anything about this?" And it was an article in a magazine that said that my 2 books of poetry were going to be published in America. Well, the publishers and I had talked about it. We had no contract. So I left the family there at Grand Central Station. I ran down the street to the publisher. I run to publishers a lot in my life. That's a theme. And sure enough, it was true. There was a publisher going to publish my 2 books. We bought another farm in New Hampshire, and I started going around reading and lecturing about poetry, what I call barding about. Eleanor was a wonderful help to me. I found myself at Tufts University, given the commencement at Tufts University, and I read 3 of my poems, and found an invitation to go the next day to the offices of Mr. Elliot Sedgwick. Remember him? At the Atlantic Monthly. I walked in and sat down. He had just gotten a letter that told him that Robert Frost was the most exciting American poet since Walt Whitman. He said, "We'd love to publish your poems. Have you got any?" I said, "You want to publish my poems?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I have 3 poems I read yesterday at Tufts University." He said, "We'll take them." I said, "Sight unseen?" He said, "Sight unseen." I said, "Do you think that my verse is too vigorous for your magazine?" Looked me straight in the eye and said, "Only an idiot would think that." I'll tell you the very best part of this story. They were the same 3 poems he had rejected. Absolutely true. So I started barding about, and I like to read poetry aloud. I believe poetry, at least my poetry, is meant to be read aloud. If you don't, I think you miss some things. This is called Vanishing Red. It's a very gruesome poem, so don't pay attention at all. It's scary in parts. There's a death in here, and bloodshed. Vanishing Red. He is said to have been the last red man in Acton, and the miller is said to have laughed, if you like to call such a sound a laugh. But he gave no one else a laugher's license, for he turned suddenly grave, as if to say, "Whose business? Whose business? I take it on myself. Why talk round the barn when it's just that I hold with getting a thing done with?" Can't get back and see it as he saw it. It's too long a story to go into now. You have to have been there and lived it. Then you wouldn't have looked on it as just a matter of who began it between the 2 races. Some guttural exclamation of surprise the red man gave in poking about the mill. Over the great big thumping, shuffling millstone disgusted the miller physically, as coming from one who had no right to be heard from. "Come, John," he said. "Do you want to see the wheel pit?" He took him down below a cramping rafter and showed him, through a manhole in the floor, the water in desperate straits, like frantic fish, salmon and sturgeon lashing with their tails. Then he shut down the trapdoor with a ring in it that jangled even above the general noise, and came upstairs alone, and laughed that laugh, and said something to the man with a meal sack that the man with the meal sack didn't catch. Then make you feel like you're there in the mill, in the noisy mill, with a millstone, clunking, clunking, over the great big thumping, shuffling millstone, give you the rhythm of what it might have been like. How to make you think about the water, you sibilants, the water in desperate straits like frantic fish, salmon and sturgeon lashing with their tails. And of course, red and white throughout the poem. Salmon, sturgeon, clean water, bloody water. I left New Hampshire, we bought another farm. This time it was in Vermont. And I was writing a poem, a giant poem, one of the longest pieces I ever wrote. The poem is called New Hampshire. That's right, I wrote New Hampshire and Vermont. And it's a long poem, 240 lines, and there are all these other little poems attached to it. And I had been writing all night, realized that the sun was coming up. I put aside my writing board and I went out on the porch. It's July. Sun's coming up, beautiful green meadows, green pine trees, and a poem comes to me, just like that. I went back into the house, I sat down, I wrote it in less than half an hour. And when you consider it's written in iambic tetrameter, that's pretty good. And turned out to be a poem that people seem to like. People seem to really enjoy this poem. We'll have a little bit of talk about it. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. By Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse was thinking queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds a sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Say it with me. Miles to go before I sleep. I don't know why I repeated that last line. Structure didn't call for a repeated line at the end, but it seemed right. And something about that echoed line, people like that. People like that poem. People like that poem a lot. I once got a letter about this poem from an English professor who said, "Dear Mr. Frost, our class is dissecting," his word, dissecting, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. We have a question for you. Can a horse be said to ask a question? Remember that part? Gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there's some mistake. I wrote him back and I said, yes, horses ask better questions than English professors. Now, people like this poem. They wondered about the man in the poem. Who is that man? Some people think that man is an old postal delivery person. You know, old postman going out, doing his rounds, going around. Some people think it's a country doctor making his rounds, seeing his patients and stopping to watch the snow fall. Some people think it's Santa Claus. Poem is whatever you think it is, but I gently point out it's a horse, not a reindeer. And I don't need to ruin this poem for you. I will tell you what it means to me. Whatever it means to you, good for you. But to me, this is a poem about death. To me, this fella is stopping and looking at those woods. And it's a rough time in his life. And he's watching the snow fall. And he's thinking about maybe just going out there and laying down and letting that snow cover him over. But So there's sorrow in it for me personally. I always say that if there's no sorrow in you as a writer of poetry, then there's no sorrow in the poem. No tears in the writer, I say, no tears in the poem, no tears in the reader of the poem. This is called My November Guest. My sorrow, when she's here with me, thinks these dark days of autumn rain are beautiful as days can be. She loves the bare, the withered tree. She walks the sodden pasture lane. Her pleasure will not let me stay. She talks, and I am fain to list. She's glad that the birds have gone away. She's glad a simple worsted grey is silver now with clinging mist. The desolate, deserted trees, the faded earth, the heavy sky, the beauties she so truly sees. She thinks I have no eye for these and vexes me for reason why. Not yesterday I learned to know the love of their November days before coming of the snow. But it were vain to tell her so, and they are better for her praise. So poetry can be a response to sorrow, to pain. There was a big news report about distances between stars, that the distances to the stars and between each one was greater than we had ever imagined, and people were going wild with terror over this news. And I let my terror be a little closer to home. Desert places. Snow falling and night falling fast, oh, fast. In a field I look into going past. In ground almost covered smooth in snow, but a few weeds and stubble showing last. The woods around it, now that it is theirs, all animals are smothered in their lairs. I am too absent-spirited to count. The loneliness includes me unawares, and lonely as it is, that loneliness will be more lonely ere it is less. A blanker whiteness of benighted snow with no expression, nothing to express. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces between stars. Stars where no human race is. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places. I have won 3 Pulitzer Prizes so far. I've shared my poetry with the world, spoken every way you can imagine. But I have had my sorrows as well. Our firstborn son, Elliot, he died when he was only 4 years old. I always blame myself for his death. I always felt I should have called the doctor sooner, but Eleanor and her mother. Our daughter, Eleanor Bettina, she only lasted a day. My sister, Jeannie, died in a mental hospital. My daughter Marjorie, she died just after childbirth. Eleanor died. Ever since the death of our 2 youngest, there was always a gap between Eleanor and I. We loved each other, but there's a poem I wrote called Home Burial. I don't read it aloud in public. I don't allow it to be read in my presence, but you might have a look at it sometime. I think it's the truest thing I ever wrote. And a few weeks ago, my son Carol took his own life. He was a poet. Burned all his I've suffered from depression most of my life. I suppose that's what I passed on to my children. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. But not to call me back, nor to say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. If I have learned anything about life, it can be summed up in 3 words. It goes on. Despite the pain, despite the sorrow, despite loss, it goes on. When I go up through the mowing field, the headless aftermath, smooth laid like thatch, but the heavy dew half closes the garden path. And when I come to the garden ground, the whir of sober birds up from the tangle of withered weeds is sadder than any words. A tree beside the wall stands bare, but a leaf that lingered brown, disturbed, I doubt not, by my thought, comes softly rattling down. I end not far from my going forth by picking the faded blue of the last remaining aster flower to carry again to you. You walk into a field that's been mown, there's death all around you, and what do? You don't just stand there looking at the death, you look for the one living bit you can find. That one blue aster flower. What's that? Life? Love? Poetry? Something. But listen, our time is almost at an end, and there's one more poem, well, maybe a couple more poems I want to share with you. People like this poem, and I like that people like this poem. I hope you like this poem. This poem doesn't mean what you think it means. Doesn't mean what you think it means. It means something totally different. But we'll talk about that after. You love the way I read this poem, all right? The road not taken. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveller long, I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, just as fair, having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. I marked the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere, ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. People love that poem. People use that poem. They use it for weddings, they use it for funerals, they use it for church services. People embrace that poem and think it's about making big choices in your life, by making a radical change, by foraging off in your... That's not what the poem's about. Did you hear the poem? It has nothing to do with that. I say there are 2 roads. Yes, the person in the poem, which is you, chooses the one slightly less traveled. But I say they're so close. They're really about the same. It's not about making a bold choice. This is a poem about the small choices we make, and how the small choices we make have a tremendous impact in our life. Listen, you come to Robert Frost's house to listen to him talk about his life. You meet someone there, you ask them out for a cup of coffee. You go for a cup of coffee, one cup of coffee becomes 20, and then there's dinners, and then there's breakfasts, and before you know it, you have 4 children, you're 88 years old, and you die in bed in the middle of passionate lovemaking because you went to listen to Robert Frost and asked someone for a cup of coffee. It's the small choices we make that changes everything in the world. So it's not the big giant changes, it's the small ones. What if I had become a professional baseball player? What if I had stayed on a farm in New Hampshire and raised children? But I became a poet of esteem. And were an epitaph to be my story, I'd have a short one ready for my own. I would have written of thee on my stone, I had a lover's quarrel with the world. Nothing gold can stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaves a flower, but only so an hour, then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. It's not quite true, is it? A tree may die, but trees go on. Flower may die, but flowers go on. Person may be lost, but people go on. Some things, like poetry, I think last. I thank you so much for coming here this evening. Perhaps we both got a little more than we expected. I'm sure Kay is very surprised, although knowing Kay, she probably figured this would happen. I hope you will always hold me with some esteem. The aim was sought. Before man to blow it right, the wind once blew itself untaught, and did its loudest day and night in any rough place where it caught. Man came to tell it what was wrong. It hadn't found the place to blow. It blew too hard. The aim was song, and listen how it ought to go. He took a little in his mouth and held it long enough for north to be converted into south, and then by measure blew it forth. By measure. It was word and note. The wind was meant to be a little through the lips and throat. The aim was song. The wind could sing. This building, Claire, correct me if I'm wrong, this building was built the year Robert Frost was born, 1874. And what an honor to be in here and performing in this restored setting. Thank you all so much for supporting this tremendous building, for supporting me. I have another show. I'm done with Robert Frost until the fall now, but I have another Frost about another Frost. I think it's easy. Another show. It's about the author C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and he was a terrific Christian apologist. And it's a one-man show about Frost that's going to be over at the Meeting House in Ipswich on the 14th. So we hope you'll come and catch us there as well. But thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Thank you.